Today, we delve into one of the most complex and contentious chapters of Moroccan history, the 44 years of the French Protectorate. Standard narratives often frame this period as a binary struggle between European colonizer and colonized Moroccan. While resistance is a vital part of that story, it is not the whole story. The reality, as we shall explore, is far more nuanced. The Protectorate was not merely imposed upon a unified Moroccan nation. It was a system built, in large part, through the active participation and collaboration of a segment of Moroccan society, its elite. The central thesis of this lecture is that the French occupation, far from uniformly dispossessing all Moroccans, created a powerful convergence of interests with the country's traditional and emerging ruling classes. The French colonial project, particularly under its first resident general, Hubert Lyautey, was predicated on a strategy of association, not outright destruction. This policy was designed to co-opt existing power structures, offering the Moroccan Maxin, the established state apparatus, rural chieftains, and urban bourgeoisie a stake in the colonial order. In exchange for their loyalty and assistance in governing, these elites were permitted to maintain, and in many cases significantly expand, their social status, political authority, and economic wealth. They did not simply benefit, they became indispensable intermediaries, the human scaffolding upon which the colonial edifice was constructed. To understand this dynamic, we must first look at the vulnerable state of Morocco on the eve of the Protectorate, then examine Lyautey's masterful strategy of co-optation, and finally analyze how different segments of the elite from the Sultan to rural cades and profited from this new order. Part I. The pre-colonial context, a state in crisis. To grasp why the French strategies succeeded, we must understand the weakness of the pre-colonial state. Throughout the 19th century, Morocco, while formally independent, had been reduced to a state of semi-colonial dependence. A series of unequal treaties with European powers, beginning with Britain in 1856 and France in 1863, pried open the Moroccan economy, flooding it with manufactured goods and undermining local artisans and producers. More insidiously, the system of capitulations and the protégé system allowed Europeans to grant Moroccan agents, including merchants and feudal lords, exemptions from sultanic justice and taxation. As the Marxist historian Lutsky notes, this created inside Morocco a wide network of agents drawn from among the local feudalists and merchants, which was not dependent on the Moroccan Sultan. By 1880, the Madrid Convention internationalized this practice, allowing more powers to grant protected status, which catastrophically drained the Maxin's treasury. Financially starved and militarily weak, the Sultanate was forced to take out crippling loans from French banks like Paribas between 1902 and 1910, deepening its dependency and paving the way for political control. When the Treaty of Fez was signed in 1912, it was the formalization of a submission that had been decades in the making. The Moroccan elite, or at least a significant portion of it, had already witnessed the power and wealth that could be derived from aligning with European interests. Part II. The Lyautey method, association, and the preservation of the façade. The architect of the French Protectorate, Marshal Hubert Lyautey, was a colonial administrator of rare insight. He understood that ruling directly, as France had done in Algeria, invited constant rebellion and was administratively costly. His solution was a policy of association, ruling through, not over, the existing elite. He famously wrote in 1913 that Moroccans were jealous to the extreme of their independence, constituting a political, religious, and economic elite that France would do ill to ignore. This was not altruism, it was realpolitik of the highest order. Lyautey's genius was to preserve the traditional structures of power while emptying them of real sovereignty. He maintained the Sultan as the symbolic ruler, presenting himself as a loyal servant. He went as far as holding the reins of the Sultan's horse in public ceremonies, a theatrical gesture of fealty that fooled few but provided a crucial symbolic cover for French rule. When the compliant Sultan Moulay Yusuf was placed on the throne in 1912 after his predecessor's abdication, the French assumed financial responsibility for the entire royal court, By 1917, the Protectorate's budget allocated over 3.5 million francs for the upkeep of the Sultan's household, supporting at least 1,200 retainers, cooks, and servants. This largesse ensured the loyalty of a vast network of people, whose livelihoods now depended on the colonial state. As academic research demonstrates, Lyautey implemented a dual cooperation policy. He maintained key institutions like the Sharia judiciary and the office of the Commander of the Faithful, effectively casting himself as the protector of authentic Moroccan values. This ensured the relative stability of the country. By striking a delicate equilibrium between the enforcement of French authority and the maintenance of the traditional Moroccan regime's outward appearance. The elite were not just puppets, they became stakeholders in a system where their authority was now backed by French military power. As one study concludes, they were able to negotiate to protect their own interests in a colonial setting, engaging in a complex relationship characterized by mutual interests. The benefits of collaboration were not distributed evenly but flowed through three primary channels: the traditional urban elite, the Maxen, the rural chieftains, the Cades, and a new bourgeoisie of merchants and landowners. Lyautey deliberately integrated Fez's old families into the new colonial administration. The Ministry of Religious Endowments, Habus, which managed vast amounts of urban property, was placed under a Fassi notable, Ahmed Jai. Under his guidance, and with French protection, the value of Habus properties skyrocketed. The ministry's income quadrupled from 1.87 million francs in 1913 to over 16.8 million francs by the 1930s. This wealth was used to build new shops, public baths, and housing in Fez, enriching the very families who administered these endowments. The same was true for the judicial system and the bureaucracy. One historian notes that at one point, there were 50 notables from Fez alone in the central government. These men, like Mohammed al-Hajoui, a former merchant's son who became the delegate for public instruction, were the intermediaries who made the system function, translating French orders into local practice and ensuring the compliance of the urban masses. Nowhere was the convergence of colonial and elite interests more starkly evident than in the countryside. The French pacification of rural areas was achieved not by force, but by empowering local strongmen. The most notorious example is Tami al-Glaoui, the Pasha of Marrakesh, leader of the Amazigh Glaoua tribe. Al-Glaoui leveraged his alliance with the French to become, by the 1930s, the third most powerful person in Morocco after the Sultan and the resident general. He was given a free hand to rule his vast territory, amassing a legendary fortune through land expropriation, taxation, and control of trade. In return, he guaranteed French interests in the south and commanded a force that could be used against any threat to colonial rule. Al-Glaoui is an extreme case, but he represents a broader class. The Protectorate allowed the commercialization of land, which had profound social consequences. The introduction of a money-based economy and French legal protection for private property enabled a new kulak class of large landowners to emerge. As one Cambridge University Press study details, this new rural elite had a clear interest in acquisition and control of land. They flourished under the Protectorate while other indigenous economic activities declined. They were also closely integrated into the French administration through the Cadet, local magistracy, giving them an evident interest in supporting the French Protectorate authorities, and little concern for nationalist aspirations. By the time of independence, landholdings of more than 10 hectares represented only 9% of farms, but accounted for 55% of all cultivated land, illustrating the profound inequalities cemented under colonial rule. C. The merchant bourgeoisie, navigating the new economy. The urban merchant class, particularly in cities like Fez, faced a dilemma. The opening of the economy threatened their traditional role, but it also offered new opportunities. While the French largely reserved large-scale industry and finance for their own settlers, Moroccan merchants could act as middlemen, suppliers, and landlords. The construction boom in the Medinas, funded by Habus wealth, created new commercial real estate. Some merchants diversified into export agriculture, purchasing land and supplying the European market. As the French administration admitted, Some of these merchant families used their positions to accumulate significant capital, even as they chafed against the political limits imposed on them. They were a conservative force, more interested in economic stability and their own prosperity than in the radical nationalism of the streets. This symbiotic relationship, however, was not static. It contained the seeds of its own destruction. The elite's loyalty to France was contingent on the protection of their interests. By the 1940s, several factors began to fray this bond. First, the economic hardships of the Great Depression and World War II, including the devastating famine of 1945, showed the limits of French economic management. The prosperity that Lyautey had promised was fragile. Second, the growing nationalist movement, embodied by the Istiqlal Party, began to gain traction. Crucially, it gained the support of Sultan Muhammad V, who had succeeded his father in 1927. The French had chosen the young Muhammad V, hoping he would be pliable. Instead, he evolved into a symbol of national resistance. His 1947 speech in Tangier, where he implicitly rejected French tutelage, was a watershed moment. This shift forced the collaborating elite to reconsider their position. They could no longer be sure that France would win, or that loyalty to France would protect them in a future independent state. The Cambridge study makes this explicit. The rural kulak class only turned towards nationalism when this elite found its economic interests threatened and realized that the nationalist movement had the support of the Sultan. In the early 1950s, as France hardened its position, many of these elites began hedging their bets. Some, like the old Pasha al-Glaoui, doubled down, famously leading the call for the Sultan's deposition in 1953. But when Muhammad V was restored from exile in 1955, al-Glaoui was forced into a humiliating public recantation, and his power was broken. The story of the Moroccan elite under the Protectorate is a story of pragmatism, ambition, and ultimately of a gamble. By accepting the French offer of association, the Maxian, the Cades, and the merchants were able to preserve their social status and, in many cases, amass unprecedented wealth. They were the indispensable intermediaries who made colonial rule possible and stable for 4 decades. However, this collaboration came at a profound cost. It entrenched a deeply unequal social structure, concentrated land ownership, and created a class of elites whose legitimacy was forever tainted by its association with the colonizer. The political scientist John Waterbury noted that many of these individuals mastered the art of navigating between competing power centers, a skill that would serve them well in the post-independence era. In the end, the nationalist movement, led by a sultan who had transcended his role as a colonial figurehead, was able to reclaim the mantle of sovereignty. But when independence was won, the old elite was not swept away. Instead, a new compromise was forged. The monarchy, the urban bourgeoisie, and the large landowners all found a place in the new Morocco, a direct legacy of the complex bargains first struck under Lyautey. The independence movement succeeded, but it did so by eventually incorporating the interests of those who had once collaborated. The history of modern Morocco, with its unique political and economic structures, cannot be understood without grappling with this uncomfortable truth: that the colonial period was not just a story of resistance, but also a story of how an elite learned to benefit from empire, a lesson that would shape the nation for generations to come.